Welcome, everyone, to our Reagan EDU chat. Today, it is my honor and my privilege to talk to a man I consider a mentor and a friend, Dr. Gordon Lloyd, one of the brightest constitutional scholars, and is just an absolute treasure. One of my favorite parts of working at the library is every once in a while, Dr. Lloyd and I get together and have meetings down in his backyard down in Malibu, California, and discuss everything under the sun. For many years, for over a decade now, he has been our featured Constitution Day lecturer. This year, however, the library was shut down due to the impact of COVID. We didn't have his constitutional lecture, but given his expertise in the Constitution, we wanted to make sure to have a chat with him and to share the many bounties of his scholarship with our audience. So Dr. Lloyd, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Tony, you are a delight. This is what, if we were to make this a constitutional day, but this would be the 11th or the 12th in a row?
This would be our 11th time around, yes.
Yeah. All right, well, for pretend purposes, we'll say it's a constitutional day, broadly understood.
Broadly understood, there we go. Okay. A lot of latitude.
Yeah, it does, it gives us a lot of latitude. How do you want to go? Ask me a question, or I can make a statement.
Well, here, I'll start with a question, and then you can feel free to make a statement if you want to get up and give a constitutional style 2-hour,
I don't have it in me.
Not idiot. Okay, you don't want to do a Hamiltonian holding forth. So the first question. So we're here today. We're gonna talk a little bit about the Electoral College, and obviously with the presidential election coming up as we record this, the presidential election is less than a week away. And there's a lot made about how we vote and the process of voting and the Electoral College, which I think, despite the fact that it pops up in the news every 4 years and we have these really interesting kind of intensive color-coded maps that every major news network talks about when they talk about the Electoral College, I still think broadly understood, many of us are not quite sure how it works. So let's go back to the very beginning. If you could give us just kind of a broad overview, constitutionally speaking, how does the Electoral College work and how did it come to be?
Okay, well, what I'm going to do is take a quick ride with you through the 88 days of the Constitution Convention in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia. And excuse me, as you've worked with me over the years, I divided into 4 acts, which is around documents and summaries. And Act 1 is the presentation of 2 basic alternative plans. One plan is the New Jersey plan, which actually, for all intents and purposes of our discussion, mimics, sort of reproduces the Articles of Confederation, which were a loose alliance between the 13 existing states. And there was no president in the Articles of Confederation. Each state had 1 vote. There was no 2 branches. There was no judiciary. So it was 1 branch of government which represented the 13 equal states. And so there may have been an administrator, but there wasn't a president. And the New Jersey plan was interested, the people behind the New Jersey plan were interested in coming to the convention to increase the powers of Congress, to tax, to regulate interstate commerce, and didn't want to really change the structure of anything at all. And then on the other hand, you have the Virginia delegation, who introduced the Virginia plan. And they're the ones who want to restructure, not just repower, but restructure. And restructuring means changing it from a 1-branch Articles of Confederation to 3 branches with a House and a Senate in bicameralism, and the introduction of a president and the introduction of a court. Now, all of this is still very sort of loose and introductory on May, at the end of May, which is in Act 1. What is interesting about the Virginia plan is that the president is elected by the Congress. We might say, well, that's a bit much. That doesn't really create an independent executive. And the answer is no, it doesn't. And the experience they're coming off is the 1776 to 1787 experience, where they decided that the founders of the various state constitutions decided to make the legislative branch the most important, and therefore, in a certain sense, the most dangerous branch. And the executive was to be elected by the state legislatures. So there was no independence for the executive in that way. You couldn't let the executive roam. And you could perhaps let the executive have a veto, but not an absolute veto like the monarch. So it's like a bundle going on. And Virginia plan called for an election by the elected representatives to Congress, and that the president would serve 7 years and no more. Okay, well, during Act 1 and Act 2 in June, most of the delegates were not really that interested in creating an independent executive or an independent judiciary. What they were concerned about was what was the structure of the Constitution with regard to the states and the nation, and what were the powers of the Constitution with regard to the states and the nation. And once that issue is settled, that doesn't mean to say they didn't return every so often, but they got trapped in a very interesting conversation, which is, well, should we have one president or two? And the answer was, well, I can't answer that question unless I know how the president is going to be elected. I can't answer that question unless I know for how long, and whether or not the president is going to be able to run again and again and again, or there are going to be term limits. I can't answer that question unless I know whether the president is going to be impeached. Oh, by the way, let's get on with something else. And so it went around and around. And the Committee on Detail in August, Act 3, came up with the first draft of the Constitution, which was outlining separation of powers, but it never left the basic notion that it was the legislative branch to elect the president. Some people came up with, well, let state legislatures do it. Others said, well, let the governors do it. Hamilton was the only one who said, let electors elect the president from electoral districts. So there was a big, so not only was there a conversation about how this should be done, but how you should do this along with all the other questions that have to be answered about the president. And, excuse me, so by the time September comes around with 2 weeks to go, they're still arguing about this various issue that I've just described, if this, and this. And so the Brewery Committee, or what also indelicately known as the Leftovers Committee, was created, and Madison got himself on there. And their big task in the first week in September was to solve this question about how the president was to be elected and how that fits in with all the other the powers, the length of term, etc. And so what they came up with was what we have called the Electoral College, but the phrase Electoral College is not in the Constitution. But that doesn't mean to say that the equivalent Electoral College is there. Well, so what is there? I mean, to keep it very, very brief now, because I've gone on, but I had to, in order to explain this. So with 2 weeks to go, they still haven't settled the issue of the presidency. And they decide to break through the problems by settling on how the president is going to be elected. Madison suggests, along with a couple of other people, have the president directly elected by the people. And the answer is no, we can't do that, because then you get into the 3/5 clause, you get into the slavery question, and how do you happen to do this? And the only way in which we've managed to come this far is because we've included the states. So you've got to include the states. So the Electoral College, which is no college at all, is that each state, so it's state-based. You're not electing the president of America, you're electing the president of the United States. So each state is allocated or allotted a number of electors or votes equal in number to the number of senates, 2, and plus however many population they have. And that now, like in California, it's 55. So if you get California, you're 20% president.
Mhm.
You lose California, you're 20% not president, right?
Yep.
States, there's nothing in the Constitution which requires winner take all. Each state has developed that, with the exception of two states, which is Nebraska and Maine. And what they do is to allocate the electoral votes in proportion to how a candidate does in each congressional district. Each state can do that. So it's up to each state in order to determine how the electors are to be elected. And what has happened over the years, because you've asked me now to move away from the fact, over the years, what has happened since about 1880, each political party gets to select its own electors. So, I mean, it's a kind of like a farce. I mean, California has 55, so the Republicans choose 55, the Democrats choose 55. And if the Democrats win, the 55 will gather in Palm Springs and say, this is a momentous occasion. Let us not be silly about this. We are, the whole fate of the Republic is in our hands. And they go, yes. Now, once or twice, you have what is known as an unfaithful elector. And each state has the possibility of punishing that elector. And even if they don't have the capacity to punish the elector, then that elector who was a wayward elector, the political career is done, it's over with. So the basic mechanism is we are electing electors who elect the president. But since the role of political parties, we are actually turning to the political parties to put forward a slate of electors who automatically get chosen in accordance with state law, in accordance with such and such. And then it's their job on after the election to count the votes. And if
Well, and just a question for you. I mean, in the way it plays out now, I mean, there are some states where if you're a selected elector for, here in California, let's say the Democratic candidate has won the last several elections in California, right? And you go to cast your vote as an elector.
Yeah.
There's a chance that there's just one name on there. You can't even be a faithless elector, right? And there's some states that even have.
Right. And we'll punish you for doing that. And you have to go through all kinds of questions like that. So, I mean, that is, so those who see some kind of undemocratic cabal conspiracy in the Electoral College, that's not there. The reason for the difficulty, this whole huge difficulty, is where do the states fit in and where do the people fit in? And we have to remember that for the first 100 years, we didn't settle that question. And part of the question was settled with the Civil War, or do you call it a war between the states? So it's only now that it's becoming more and more a progressive populist cause to end the Electoral College. Now, there's been only 4 times, it might be 5th, but there's 4 times where the person who won the national popular vote, which really doesn't matter because that means you're electing a president of America, which is not what we're doing. The president of America is the same person as the president of the United States, except on 4 occasions. It so happens that one of those occasions was 1876, which was a huge Tilden thing, and it was a terrible thing that it takes us beyond what we need to do. But what is fascinating now is that it has happened twice within this century, in the year 2000 and the year 2016. And so it is no longer one of those things that let's talk about when we don't have when we have less time to chat about and the peculiarity of all of this. It's now much more of an urgent question. And the urgency of the question is, are we a nation of states or are we a nation of people? And that still is, and it doesn't make any sense to students who think we're a nation of people. We go from one state to another state, and nothing changes. Basically, it's the same country. Well, that's not necessarily the case when the founding occurred. You had to put together such a country. And the irony, and I'll end this in this note so you can ask me some more questions, is the irony is, what happens if the Electoral College doesn't produce a majority of electoral votes, which in this case will be 270?
Mm-hmm.
And why 270? 435, the House, plus 100, the Senate, plus 3, because we pretend, we have to pass out a constitutional amendment to pretend that Washington, D.C. is a state, but only for this purpose. After that, it's no longer a state, but only for this purpose. So you have 435 plus 100 plus 3, you divide by 2, you get 270. You have to get 270 to win. So sometimes there's a third party candidate who wins. Sometimes there's not. So what happens if there's not 270? No one actually wins the electoral vote for president of the United States, even though they may win the electoral vote for president of America.
Mm-hmm.
Well, under the Constitution, the answer is the presidential vote, who shall become president, goes to the House. And there are 435 members of the House, and it takes 26 votes to win. That is, each state votes by one state, one vote. So you say the 53 Californians get together to cast one vote. The person from Alaska talks with himself or herself and says, well, how shall I do this? How shall I do this? What shall I go to do? I cast one vote. That's not fair. It's not democratic, but it is federal. It does take into account. So you go to the People's Branch, which is the House, and you vote federally. The vice president goes to the states branch, and there they vote nationally, so that there are 50 states, but it takes 51 votes to become vice president. And I hope I've explained it in a way which is understandable. It's not really understandable if you want to put out a map and logic and understand this. This is the result of dynamics at the Constitutional Convention and can be changed. Some of the words that we have used here, you cannot find in the Constitution. Therefore, it's at the discretion of the states. So there's a whole bunch of things we can do short of causing an uproar over this. And if the person who just won the popular vote also won the electoral vote, then we wouldn't have a real problem. It's just that you have to return to what it was before, which is an anomaly. But the problem is it's happened twice now within 21st century. So hey, is it really an anomaly anymore?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and so to kind of go back to the initial formation of the Electoral College, you were talking about how, they talked about different methods of voting for the president, right? You could have Congress could elect directly, right? Or state legislators, or, if you just a direct, kind of popular election with the people. And each of those were rejected. In the sense, a lot of the Constitutional Convention is about limiting power and about balancing power. Mm-hmm. And about, how do you properly place the right amount of power in the right people's hands at the right time to ensure that you don't slip into a monarchy, which is what the United States was kind of comparing, right? They said, we don't want to create what we came from. What we have with the Articles of Confederation is kind of a convoluted mess. We can't really get things done. So how do we find a new system where we can get things done? We have an executive. And for the most part, as they were forging the Constitution, they knew that first executive would be George Washington.
That's right. That would help.
But they also knew not every executive would be George Washington.
That's
so
right.
How do you
George Washington knew that himself.
Yeah.
Well, he limited himself to 2 terms. There was nothing in the Constitution which required the president to be limited to 2 terms. The interesting thing is that the first time a president is limited to 2 terms is after FDR, who served 4 terms. And he had to do that by constitutional amendment. And he was a beloved Democrat. And that amendment could not have passed if the Democrats didn't vote in favor of it. Mm-hmm. Across the country, there were not enough Republicans to pass that amendment.
Yeah. Well, it's fascinating. And do you think, the idea, well, going back to the origins of the Electoral College. So we call it the Electoral College. As you point out, that language is not in the Constitution. It's come to be called the Electoral College. Where does that phrase come from?
Well, I've tried to track it down, but I think the closest I can come up with is the College of Cardinals electing a Pope.
Okay.
And so, right, I mean, that's the closest I can explain it to people, is that the cardinals are there. Of course, they're not elected by the people. They're
Hmm.
appointed by the Pope and such as, this College of Cardinals is to sort of deliberate without popular interference to see who the next Pope's going to be. And if it's right, the smoke comes out. If it's not correct, then you have to wait a little while. And I think, I can't prove it, but I think that the idea of the Electoral College is linked to the College of Cardinals in terms of electing the president, electing the Pope. The phrase is not there, but what is there is that, as you pointed out just a few minutes ago, the number of checks and balances. So you have electors electing electors who will elect.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not top down like the Pope. It's from the grassroots going up to electors elect. And the framers, they've been accused of not being democratic. They've been accused, particularly with the Electoral College, that didn't trust the people. That's not the case. The case is that they didn't trust the people gathering on one spot. Because as Madison said, even if every Athenian were a Socrates, right, it would still be a riot, a lunacy, in order to go through with that kind. You need filters.
Hmm.
And so this idea of direct election, like, don't like, is not what that is. So if they could get rid of that, if that's what democracy is, I like, don't like, then yes, the framing is undemocratic. But if democracy can be stretched to mean that the vote of the people is the ultimate matter that counts, that they elect electors. Why? Because you cannot, because the understanding with because you're trying to balance states and a nation, and and so that balance was going on. That dynamic, I think, was taking place. So if you gather, even if you gather every Athenian who's a Socrates on the spot, it would still be a mob. I don't think they were against democracy; they're against mobocracy. And so filters. Now, I understand you have to. The important question to ask Madison is, all right, so how do you know with your filters you're letting the good things through and you're stopping the bad things? How do you know that? Well, we learn from experience. It's an experiment, right? But the Electoral College, I don't think, is absolutely vital to the working of the Democratic Republic. What is vital is that there's a conversation that takes place. Right? It can be just between the people. It can be between presidential candidates. It can be between electors who then discuss with each other what is going on. It can be within the parties. But somewhere down that line, along the line between no president and president, there must be a whole set of discussions that have taken place and conversations that have taken place, and that outcomes have been determined and decided, and we have moved on from there. It has not been just simply off with his head, on with the throne, as you suggested. It's going to be reflectively, reflection and choice. And that's it. Can we be democratic and decent? Can we be democratic and reflective? Or does democratic mean throwing bombs? Does democratic mean getting my way instantly? Or does democratic include the possibility of filters and slowing things down and waiting until tomorrow? That I think is, but how I would understand the Electoral College, and the idea that somehow it is an undemocratic replica from the past, doesn't understand why the Electoral College came into being, or why it waited 1 week before the end, or 10 days before the end of the convention to settle this thorny issue of, well, if this, then this, then this, then this, then this. And we could amend it. And one of the things that Washington decided, and Jefferson followed him, and Madison followed him, and Monroe followed him, you don't need a constitutional amendment if you have good character. I'm just going to limit myself to 2 terms. That is what we need. And that is part of, shall we say, the tradition which develops. And that's why Washington was so important to be first, that he could set that tradition.
Yeah. So a couple of things I want to follow up on. One, just so for folks who are trying to understand the Electoral College. So one, when you actually go to cast your vote, so for folks who are going to cast their vote, whether they've already cast it and mailed it in or dropped it off at a ballot box, or they're going to go stand in person,
Right.
they're not actually voting for the person whose name they fill in. They're voting for the elector chosen by the party who wins either statewide or, in the case of Maine and Nebraska, their congressional district. Is that correct?
That's correct. I'm not voting as an American. I'm voting as a Californian, and I'm voting as a member, a Californian, understanding that the political parties play a huge role, that the state legislature has determined in California to cast all Electoral College votes, all votes, all 55, to the winner of the popular vote in the state. But that is not required by the Constitution. And Maine and Nebraska haven't. They've done it proportionally.
Yeah.
So why did states decide to do that? My goodness, think about the impact that California had. I used to follow this some years ago, and it was, if you wanted to call a close election, presidential election in the United States, you figure out how California and New York are going. And it used to be in the 40s and 50s, and then there's a famous Truman picture of,
Dewey defeats Truman.
Yeah. Is that California carried the Republican Party for a long time with Eisenhower, Nixon, Reagan, and so that the Democrats almost had to carry New York. So you had an East Coast, West Coast battle. People who were in favor of the Electoral College said, see, at least the candidates had to go to both coasts. Now it doesn't work out that way. People in favor of the Electoral College has to say, see, they have to go to flyover America. You don't have to go. So it's the case in favor tends to shift not just on political personality, but tends to shift on demographics, where people are. It used to be like a real toss-up in the 50s, 60s between New York and California. And that's how the political parties had their base. And then the Democrats would go south and the Republicans would go Midwest, and then it changed. And so that's, I think the Electoral College gives its shape to the way political parties have developed, and how political parties have worked with state legislatures.
Yeah. I'm looking at the clock. Half an hour goes by very quickly. We have a couple minutes left, so I have two more questions for you.
Yeah, yes. The first one is yes, and the second one is no.
Well, the first one, you think back to the origins of the Electoral College, and the first time it was employed in the election of George Washington, it was unanimous, right? He was unanimously elected, the only president to be so in the Electoral College, and twice. And if you look at recent electoral maps, I mean, the closest I think we've come since then is the Reagan re-election, where he won 49 states, right?
Yeah.
And if you look at recent maps, they have not been, the map is, it's kind of all over the place. Do you think we'll get to a point with the way that political parties are involved in the Electoral College process, the polarization of the country, that we'll see an electoral map ever again that represents some sort of unanimity? So, you talk about, is this America? We're kind of in acclamation. Hey, here's one leader for all, or is this a, kind of this difference of states? Do you see that sort of Electoral College happening ever again?
I hope so. I used to defend the Electoral College on the ground that it exaggerated the extent to which the winner of the popular vote actually won the popular vote. If you compare the votes between FDR and Hoover over those elections, you will see that they weren't that far apart. I mean, it's not 53 to 46, something like that. I mean, to me, that's not just huge. But if you take a look at the Electoral College votes, it exaggerates the winner, because it's winner take all. And so I hope that we come back to those days when the Electoral College can be looked upon as settling the dispute, so we don't have to recount the votes, so we don't have to go and say, who did somebody cheat? Did somebody do such a? It's so clear I hope we go back to that. Will we? I think we need a change in climate, because right now I don't see that. I see from 2000 to 2016 we're seeing legal challenges. There are lawyers all over the place. Citizens are not there, lawyers are there.
Yeah. Well, and then the last question I'll leave you with is, there has been grumbling. I mean, there's been grumbling throughout the history of the country. We need this amendment. We need to change this aspect of the Constitution, and it's been amended, 27 times. Do you think there will be an amendment, or the country will get to the point where they want to do away with the Electoral College in favor of a direct popular election?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. If, and I have to put a caveat, I don't think there'll be any question of doing away with it if the 2000 election and 2016 election hadn't turned out like that, so back to back, and the courts have got themselves involved. There is a process for solving that, and it's Congress. Mm-hmm. And we didn't follow the process because it was too important to let Congress decide what was going to happen. In some way, we had to go to the courts. So I would say that if we continue down this road, there's going to be yet in 2020, 2024, there's going to be yet another challenge, and that the winner of the popular vote won't win the Electoral College vote. And I do think there's going to be a very strong movement to have direct election of the president. But I think it depends upon that. In other words, what you have to do is to say that the danger is so imminent and so regular that we have to do something about it, that it is not so far-fetched, only once in a lifetime, twice in a decade. Why are you getting all so upset about it? But usually the Electoral College exaggerates the winner. So why are you getting so upset? So I think the answer is, if this phenomenon, which has happened twice now in the 21st century, continues for a couple of more times, I think the answer is yes.
The answer is yes. Okay. And last question I'll leave you with. I know that you, like I am, are a vigorous supporter of the importance of civic learning and civic education.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I'm gonna give you a closing word on why is it important for us to know and to understand our past and our founding.
Well, there's an old-fashioned answer which I will start with, and that is the word republic. It means public things, public concerns. Res means things, and publica means public things. And so you have to have a public spirit in order to be a citizen, a member of the city of a republic. But we're a democratic republic, not an aristocratic republic where we don't expect emoluments, we don't expect titles of nobility. So that the expectations on citizenship are far less, shall we say, enduring, far less imposing than they were in the previous centuries. But that doesn't mean to say they're no less endearing. And what bothers me, and I'll put it in these words, you cannot love a country that has an ugly founding. Okay, you and I have talked about that a lot. And it's not that you have to create civic education, which puts George Washington in every classroom, maybe just every other. You don't have to put him in every classroom, except. But it's the what is it that you teach? What do you teach? I mean, I'm in favor of projects that challenge the traditional view of America as all good, such and such. But I don't think it's accurate just to let them hang out there as if they were the truth. They need to be brought into the conversation. So the 1619 project, for example, I think should be brought into the conversation. That is, what is it about 1619 that is so important for civically minded people to know? I think the answer is because for too long, here goes the defenders of it, that for too long we understood that it was the white folks who mattered and that the black folks didn't matter, and that we ignored slavery. So we need to bring back slavery into the argument. Okay, I buy that. I've been very interested in doing that, but not at the expense of canceling bourgeois culture, American traditions, etc., and making this the only story. Because that, I think, is what is happening now. We're making something, one story, the only story. And I think what we have to remember is that the American story is a story of hope. It's a story. Why? I'm an immigrant. I couldn't believe it when I first came here to hear Americans run down America. It's just amazing. It is the land of opportunity. Now, you see, I could be accused of just ringing the bell, ringing such and such and such. But you ask immigrants who come here, sure, they have to run through problems. Sure, they have to sign up for the draft. Sure, they have to do such and such. But the best the immigrants, I think, on the whole, asterisk with this exception, they're the best storytellers of America.
Excellent.
I wish you Americans would love your own country. By the way, I've been reading Reagan's speeches, etc., because David Davenport and I are doing something on civic education with it, and it's amazing about how he is portraying the land of hope, the land of opportunity. It's amazing, and I had forgotten that. I mean, it's sort of just sunk in, but almost like every address goes back to that issue.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a good place for us to draw our conversation to a close. Gordon, I thank you so much. It's I always love talking to you about anything, but especially about the Constitution. Appreciate your insights into the Electoral College, and we'll look forward to connecting with you again soon.